Hi everyone. So hope you'll excuse the setting. I'm in my bedroom. Still a bit cold. The aftermath of these storms, I think. And I'm a little bit tired, so I'm just kind of taking it easy. But finally got some space on this, so I'll take advantage of it. Um, Before I get onto the main subject of this video, a little update on the Brendan Kavanagh thing. He's went back to St Pancras Station to the piano, and it's wonderful. Some people have donated him Winnie the Pooh bears, and he didn't actually get the reference, but the China watchers among us will know what that refers to. Namely, that in mainland China, Winnie the Pooh is effectively banned because a few years ago there was a sort of satirical comparison between Winnie the Pooh and Xi Jinping. Uh, Jinping is a somewhat rotund man, and there's a passing resemblance, and basically it's a satirical comparison. So for a while now, that's being used by dissidents as a sort of way to mock the Chinese leadership and their absurd sensitivities. But I thought that was great. He made the point that it's a CCP free zone. Um, I mean, this whole thing, I think, really has become something of a cause celebre in terms of what it means to have CCP infiltration in this country. Now, this video is not about that, so I'm just going to mention this briefly. My own video on it's already got almost 2,000 views, which by my standards is quite a lot. I'm pleasantly surprised by that. I mean, most of my videos average about 50 or 60 views, so that's good. Just, it keeps the issue in the public domain. So far, his original video is still up, so that's good. There was a real threat that would be taken down, and it still might. Still might. If YouTube makes that absurd decision, then there should be a huge backlash against it. Why does it matter? It matters for context. Because at the moment, these pathetic communists are trying to smear him and try to make false allegations about him. But anyway, that's that. I just thought I'd mention it because it's the latest. But I think it's great to kind of mock their hypersensitivity and show that this country should indeed be a CCP free zone everywhere in Britain, except perhaps the Chinese embassy. But that's it. Anyway, one aspect of that, the two things I'm talking about aren't unrelated because one aspect of the whole Brendan Kavanagh incident was the reaction of the British Transport Police woman. And, she has not come out well from all of this. Her whole attitude was immediately to take their side, immediately to assume guilt. I saw a video earlier where a former police officer was analysing her attitude, and he thought that she seemed amateur. She seemed like she wasn't following the right procedure because she hadn't sort of looked at evidence, i.e., their complaint, and then went in with an open mind and just asked him what happened. She immediately went in accusing him, so she was very unprofessional. But I'd like to think that was just one incompetent police officer, but I don't know. I think that there is signs, in that case, it's British Transport Police, but the Metropolitan Police have also pandered to Chinese sensitivities. I mentioned the Drew Pavlo thing. Now, a while back, I made a video on policing in the UK, and it also got quite a few views by the standards of my channel. I think this is a very big issue. Because I see a lot of different responses to this. Now, I've just watched a video which really is an example of what should be back to basics policing. There was a drug dealer in Peterborough, I think it was 9 months ago, and there's body cam footage of this. And, he runs away from the police tackle him. He gets into a physical fight with one of the officers, and they threaten to taser him. He ended up getting 3.5 years for assaulting a police officer and drug dealing. Um, but that would be an example of back to basics policing, i.e., the police tackling clearly a criminal, a drug dealer, um, and someone who's prepared to use violence. Now, thankfully, no weapon was involved, but the police didn't know that. Um, but people were writing comments underneath like, "Oh, the police can't do anything nowadays." Here's the thing: it has to be said, public trust in the police is probably at an all time low. I'm sure there's been points in the past where there was also, I mean, it's not entirely a new thing. This is something that has to be understood. Cynicism with the police is not entirely a new thing. At the height of the Whitechapel murders in 1888, there was very little confidence in the police. So there's always been periods of the police's history in this country where there's been public cynicism. In the 80s, when there was the urban riots, there was deep mistrust between the police and certainly minority communities. But I do think we are in a period where there's particularly bad level of cynicism. And I have to say, a lot of it is their own fault, the police I'm talking about. Now, I've worked a little bit with the police. On my local residents association for a brief time, I was a police liaison for community police officers, and it was only a short time I was in that role, but I had a good working relationship with them. It was, my own dealings with the police has mostly been good, as a victim of crime, and also in my capacity as sort of community work I've done in various places I've lived, just residential type things. Um, in my area where I live, Northumbria Police, I have to say I've had generally a good experience with them. I mean, I've never had big problems with them as a force. Now, other people might say something different. I know they've had their controversies over the years, but my own dealings with Northumbria Police are quite professional. In fact, recently there was an incident on Christmas Eve whereby, and I won't go into all the details here simply because I do, out of respect for the privacy of my neighbours, but basically I saw a guy really vandalizing a vehicle. Like really, it wasn't a case of trying to steal something. He was really, it looked like a vindictive thing. It was quite unsettling to watch. I mean, he had some sort of baseball bat or some sort of weapon. Um, Anyway, I sort of went down. I don't know what the plan was. I was going to phone the police or something. He was making a right racket. But anyway, the police were immediately there. So obviously someone else had tipped them off. They obviously knew about this. He'd already vanished. Um, but they basically asked for access to get through the street because it's a gated area. I let them through, and I spoke to the officers, just told them what I saw. But that was an example again, and it has to be said all over the country tonight there will be police doing things like that. They will be, putting their safety at risk to tackle criminals. So we shouldn't forget there is that aspect, and there are many decent officers, and personally brave officers who will do what they're meant to do as police officers. I mean, it's not an easy job. It isn't. There is dangers involved. They're tackling some dangerous people. They're putting themselves on the front line. So I acknowledge all of that, and it's always important to remember that. But the problem is when the police get it wrong, the public pick up on that, and it's not good enough to say it's just one or two isolated incidents. It's too many one or two isolated incidents. This is the problem. Um, I mean, that example of the British Transport Police woman is just one example. This is the truth. Well, when people, for example, get burgled and the police don't turn up for hours, there's a perception that they don't care. But that may not be fair, but that is the perception. And then you get, people remember COVID. People remember that the police were very quick to enact the rules there. There was a case where South Yorkshire police turned up to a man's doorstep in Sheffield and told him he wasn't meant to be in his own garden. I think even if technically they were upholding the law, people do question, well, why were you so efficient with that? Why were you so quick to enact the law then when it was easy, basically, relatively easy, really, to harass people going about their daily business? Now, when you get serious crimes that affect people's lives, like burglaries, the police response is far too often it's inefficient. They arrive late. Very often the burglars aren't apprehended. I appreciate the police can only go on the information they have, but sending out the message, for example, that shoplifters are not going to take that seriously, that is completely wrong. In the grand scheme of things, it's not the most serious crime, but for a small shopkeeper, that is really, really affecting their livelihood. In Leeds, which is supposed to be the capital of shoplifting, it's a city that has the worst shoplifting rates. Apparently, I think it's Kirkgate Market. retailers have just given up. They've just resigned themselves to the fact that criminal gangs go in and just take things in broad daylight with no fear of justice. That's rotten. That has to change. So I think the police need to do a lot more to basically take every crime as a crime. Now, I appreciate that if they have a workload, they have to prioritize. If they have a murder case or a rape case, that has to obviously be the priority. But they cannot send out the message that they don't care. I mean, it's no good selling the public, oh, but we can't deal with crime unless you report it, when the public will turn around and say, well, wait a second, I do report this, but nothing happens. Your officers don't show up, and I don't think it's enough to say there isn't enough police around. I honestly do think their priorities are skewed. I mean, take for example the time that Metropolitan Police woman, I don't know her name, um, she spent harassing Mr. Kavanagh. I don't know what would have been a good 10, 15 minutes. Now, at any given time in London, you're going to have a lot of crime on the transport system. Um, she could have been tackling any number of other incidents. Instead, she is putting her energies into harassing him. Basically, I call it harassment because that's what it was. Immediately going on the attack, immediately being acting in an accusing way. Her communication was terrible. She's just making up things on the spot. It's not illegal to say we're not in China. That's absurd. Um, I really think that is the sort of policing. So, when people sort of say, oh, the police get a bad reputation, and officers themselves complain about this, I would say, well, look at that. That is the reason why. It's not that people aren't sympathetic to the job that officers do. In fact, I want police officers to be empowered. I want police officers to be able to do their job. I'm pro police. I'll tell you what, I'm not pro. I'm not pro officers getting the wrong priorities and thereby, damaging public trust. I'm also not for officers abusing their power. Um, when you get, for example, racist police officers or misogynistic police officers, they have no business wearing a uniform because they're supposed to be, safeguarding everyone. And if you have officers with those attitudes, if they're joking about rape, if they are, that is not banter. I don't accept that. And I think the Metropolitan Police is rotten with it. I mean, it's no good to say, oh, most officers are decent. If the decent officers are not speaking out, if they're not calling out the rotten apples in their midst, then frankly, they're complicit in it. And then you have a situation where you get officers who are tackling dangerous criminals, and people say, oh, well, the public isn't supporting them, they need to support them. I totally agree. But what I'm saying here is right now, the police are not going through good PR. I think the general feeling in the public is they have their priorities wrong. Um, and there will be officers maybe even watching this video and they're thinking, well, I tried to do my job as best as I can. I'm tackling criminals, I'm putting my safety on the line. And I say thank you. I know that there are officers doing that. I know that. But unfortunately, it's not enough when you get officers who are abusing their position and who are making the wrong decisions. It has to be said, often this comes down to chief constables making the wrong priorities. I don't necessarily blame bobbies on the beat, if you see them nowadays, um, because they are following orders. Now, sometimes you get individual officers who, I don't know what rank that police officer who spoke to Mr. Kavanagh was. Um, if she is a new officer, then she needs retraining. If she's an experienced officer, frankly, I would strike her off, or at least, if I was her senior commander, I would be giving her a real dressing down, frankly, for that, because it's the sort of thing that damages public trust. Maybe not lose her job over it, but I would give her a dressing down for sure. And definitely, she needs to reevaluate whatever training she's looking at, because if she's going around basically acting as a sensitivity officer for foreign agitators, then that really is an example of where their priorities are skewed. So I think this is a very, very important issue. So what needs to happen? I think officers do need to be empowered to tackle criminals and get back to basics. That's why when you get something like stop and search, the public need to understand that that actually can be effective, and officers need the support to do that, and not people constantly yelling racism at them, for example. But officers themselves, or forces, I should say, themselves, they can't just complain about, oh, well, the media is making us look bad, or, they can't really blame the government or the media. At some point, the police themselves are accountable in the sense that they are making decisions here. They're making decisions on the strategies that they're using, what they're choosing to prioritize. I accept that they won't be able to solve every crime, but there are far too many crimes that go unsolved because I think they've got the priorities wrong. And that totally damages public trust. When they're dealing with victims of crime, they need to deal with them in a compassionate and sympathetic way because they're dealing with this stuff every day. But for a victim of crime, that's something that suddenly happened out of the blue. If someone's been assaulted or they've had something stolen from them, they're going to be traumatized. Now, the chances are the police officer is the first person they're speaking to, a first responder. So the officer needs to be trained to deal with them in a sympathetic way. The victim's going to be angry, they're going to be distressed, so that's very, very important. They need to give them reassurance that they'll take it seriously. But I think some conservatives defend the police too much, and there's some left wingers that don't appreciate the situation that officers are in. So it's kind of two differing approaches, and I think they're both wrong. The conservatives who go out of the way to defend the police, they fail to recognise that actually there is serious ground for criticism. And I think there's people in the police themselves that realize this. I'm sure there would have been female officers who were disgusted by the likes of David Carrick and Wayne Couzens. Now, they were held to account. It's good that they were not above the law, but no police officer should be above the law. If a police officer breaks the law, they should be held to account. They should be arrested or questioned. There shouldn't be a special rule for the police. Now, we're not as bad as some countries, but there have been times the police have got away with things that the public wouldn't. And this isn't in the course of doing the job, this is in the context of abusing their power. So that's very, very important. Um, I just think it's a question of priorities and it's a question of what are the decisions that chief constables are taking. As an example, I mean, this is why I don't buy the excuse of stretch resources. You cannot tell me the problem is stretch resources when they are choosing to spend time on non-crime hate incidents, so called. I mean, I think the whole way that is defined is very troubling because all it takes is one overly sensitive person to say they're offended by something, particularly if race is concerned, and then the police will be questioning someone. There's been many examples of this. The Israel Palestine protests, again, people question where were the police priorities. They did eventually start cracking down on jihadists and people chanting anti Semitic slogans, but initially they took a hands off approach to that. They did. So, those conservatives who comment on videos about the police and say, oh, the police can't do anything now without being criticized, things like that. Well, look at their priorities. And actually, there are some on the right who also criticize the police because they sort of look at it as too many forces, too many chief constables have basically gone woke in the sense that they are prioritizing words and feelings over actual crimes. I mean, when you get officers turning up at someone's doorstep because they've used the wrong pronouns online, and this isn't hyperbole, this has happened, it's a disgrace. It's a waste of resources. So I think that, the police should have absolutely no consideration whatsoever for so-called non-crime hate incidents. The clue is in the title. If it's not a crime, the police have no business being involved, really. So I am pro police. I want police to be able to do their jobs, do back to basics policing, and tackle criminals. I want them to have the power to do that, and the power to know that when they're doing it, they're not going to be prosecuted. There are times, police get criticism and I take their side. For example, there was a case last year where they were pursuing two teenagers on electric scooters in a suburb of Cardiff, I believe it was, if I got that right. It was either Cardiff or Swansea, I can't remember off the top of my head. But the two boys died, and the police were immediately, condemned. the fact of the matter is, those kids, it's sad what happened, two young lives lost, but they were doing a reckless thing. What if they had killed a younger child? What if a little toddler had been walking out in the road and they knocked him down? That sort of antisocial behavior can really, really impact people's quality of living. So in that incident, I don't see anything that the officers done wrong. They were pursuing, suspects engaging in that activity. So there are times that the police get criticised, and actually you think, well, wait a second, they're doing what they're meant to be doing as police officers here. So I do think there's a permissiveness in our country from some elements who basically think criminality and antisocial behaviour should get a free pass. It shouldn't. Police should be empowered to act on those things, and they shouldn't have to fear then they're going to get investigated or they'll go through some legal wrangling as a result. They should be free to do their job. But the police themselves have to get their priorities right, and they have to explain to the public when they don't get it right. When they miss opportunities. The I was going to make a video on this, I may still do so, about the Nottingham attack. Nottinghamshire police missed opportunities to arrest that guy. Now they did say that even if they'd held him, it would have been in their powers to X, Y, and Z. Okay, but I still think they could have done more. Um, because even if there was limits on what they could do, they could have at least, after the violent incidents, it wasn't followed up. For example, why he absconded. Norfolk recently, Norfolk constabulary, that tragedy, probably a murder suicide. A father, a man, his wife, and two children were found dead in a house outside Norwich, and Norfolk constabulary they got a phone call from a man an hour before this. They didn't bother doing anything. Why not? Why not? This happens far, far too much. So I think, it's going to vary from force to force. We can't just say the police are all the same. Some forces will be better than others. Um, but generally, I think the police are having a serious PR problem right now, and I think it's because too often they look like they take the soft options. Now, I know individual officers take risks. I know that individual officers do brave things. That's not to mitigate that, but there is skewed priorities sometimes. Um, Yet another example I could think of, I made the video of this at the time, the young woman who was arrested and held during the coronation for hours. Now, the context of that was that the eco groups had threatened protest, and with good reason, the police were, very cautious about that. But it was abundantly clear that she was not a member of Just Stop Oil. They could have seen that she was dressed up for the royal event. They held her for 8 hours. Of course, her day was ruined. She missed this historic event. Um, the Metropolitan Police then claimed it was an outside force, but regardless, there's a lack of common sense. This is one of the biggest problems with policing now. There's just a lack of common sense. If I was an officer, I'd be looking at, well, is this person a Just Stop Oil protester? Get a female officer to search her, see does she have any spray on her, does she have anything that would be liable to cause disruption? And if the answer is no, then let her go. There's a common sense deficit. So that's what I say needs to change. Forces need to get their priorities right. They need to focus on the sort of crime that the public are concerned about: burglaries, antisocial behaviour, violence, that sort of thing, sexual crimes. Those are the things that they need to take seriously, not policing pronouns or looking at non-crime hate incidents. Police should have no business doing that at all, wasting resources. Um, but the public, for our part, we need to support the police when they are in difficult situations and recognise that there's times that force does have to be used. And that isn't police brutality. If the context warrants it, if they're dealing with a dangerous offender, then it warrants it. And they have to have the confidence that they can do their job and they're not going to face legal wrangling as a result of it. So that's my take on policing in Britain today. I think it's probably a thankless job, but the police have brought some of this on themselves with the wrong priorities and with a lack of common sense. And frankly, even if they haven't been trained, they should just use basic, Policing used to be about use common sense. Look at the situation, judge it in a critical way, not just be a robot, not just come out with the sort of disgraceful policing that British Transport police officer was showing with Mr. Kavanagh. Basically acting as a sensitivity guardian for Chinese nationalists. It was pathetic. Um, and I have to say, I think it was an easy choice. Why did she choose to do that? Why did she go down that line? I appreciate that when that Chinese group went over and complained, they have to do something, but they could come over. They could have dealt with that situation, as the officer did. Actually, her colleague did initially do this. Look at the situation. Maybe speak to Mr. Cohen and say, "Look, we've had this complaint. Have you said anything racist?" Just ask him. Just ask the question. Establish what's happened. Establish the miscommunication. And then when that was established, as it was, don't like her mistake was to get aggressive, to tell him to stop filming, to just come up, basically make up laws on the spot that were not laws. She was basically acting as a force unto herself. She was completely in the wrong, and I think she should get a dressing down by her superior. Um, and they should issue an apology to Mr. Kavanagh. Um, but that's an example. They should have approached that situation in a much different way. By all means, ask him questions, try and establish what happened, but then tell the Chinese group, look, we acknowledge your complaint, but he hasn't committed any crime. This is a public space. May we suggest you move on? And then leave it at that. And actually, if I were him, I would have turned it around and said, actually, officer, this young man's threatening me. He's just yelled at me very publicly. I feel threatened by it or something. I would have turned it around myself. But I think British policing has a crisis of confidence right now, and I think a lot of it is brought on by officers themselves. When politicians talk about this stuff, they're often accused of attacking the police, and both Labour and the Tories accuse each other of doing this. But if they're being honest, they also want to see a situation where the police themselves are improving public confidence. So both parties do this. They kind of, weaponize the police a bit. The police themselves have to do much, much more to improve public confidence. They need to be seen to be tackling crime. And I appreciate they can't solve everything, they can't be everywhere at once, but at the very least, they need to be more of an effort. For example, in burglaries, every single case should be tackled. There shouldn't be a case where they're turning up 7 hours later with a half bothered attitude. It's really not good enough. So a lot needs to be done, but I am pro police. I want to see a back to basics policing, and I'm 100% behind the police with that. But bad officers need to be held to account. That is a no brainer. Okay, let me know your thoughts.